under the broad heading of Learning from Orthodoxy. Last week we were looking at a set of creative prayers. So this week's talk is mostly all in Calum's hands, but just for those of you who weren't here last week, to introduce Calum. I don't quite know how to introduce you, as I know you in so many different ways, but Calum is a minister in the Free Methodist Church and currently lives in Kenya, but only for 8 more days, I think, yes? Or 7 more days. And they're returning to the United States shortly, but currently the African Nazarene University did a MPhil in Medieval History at Cambridge, and that's when we met and became friends before anything else happened. And more latterly, Calum and I worked together in various ways on Ethiopian Christian literature, Ethiopian Orthodox Christian literature. And this talk, the impact of cultural dynamics on spiritual perception, the cult of saints in the Ethiopian Orthodox Täwaḥǝdo Church, is something that's derived from, but not focused just on the research that you're doing for your doctoral work, isn't it? It's derived from that, but I'll leave Calum to explain how it connects with his research topics. There is a handout so for those of you in the room, there's a printout, and I will put, for those of you who are on Zoom, I will put it in the chat now so that you can download it. It's just a couple of pages of a PDF. So over to you, Calum, to introduce your theme and tell us something about spiritual perception.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ralph. I'm honored to be here, and I hope that this talk is meaningful. I want to give the same disclaimer I gave last time, which is that my internet is more unreliable than other places with unreliable internet. If you see the lights go out behind me, then that means power has gone and my internet might fail. But I'll watch my phone, Ralph, and you can try to send me a message if that happens. Yeah. I'm on the outskirts of Nairobi. Okay, you've probably noticed that the date on your handout there is incorrect. I apologize, I forgot to change that. The reason for that is because I first gave a version of this talk a few months ago to the European Academy of Religion. In that context, I was speaking largely to an Orthodox Christian audience, and so I was able to take certain things for granted. And that was part of a project called the Spiritual Perception Project. A couple of volumes have been published by OUP. But for today, I'm going to kind of tweak the paper a bit and try to move the focus a bit more towards the cult of saints in Ethiopia. And that's especially because Ralph told me that that this audience today is perhaps slightly less familiar with Orthodox traditions, or perhaps less sympathetic. So essentially what I'm doing here, in a way, is providing a sort of apologetic for the cult of saints within Orthodox Christianity generally. But I want to do that by highlighting unique cultural and theological aspects of the Ethiopian Orthodox traditions specifically. In other words, I'm arguing that the Ethiopian tradition, because of its ancient and non-Western Christian culture, exhibits perhaps the healthiest, or perhaps we might say the purest, cult of saints found within Christianity today. Is everything good? Is for my volume and everything like that, Ralph?
Yeah, we're good. Loud and clear.
Reading my paper. All right, I'll try to be animated because I know you're all staring at my head. So the last kind of caveat is that I've written a slightly longer paper. At a few points, I'll reference sections that I'm not going to speak about specifically. That's actually a good thing. I think I'm intending to leave plenty of time for Q&A, and so if I skip over something in the paper you want to ask more about, we can discuss that together. This paper considers how cultural dynamics and presuppositions influence the process of spiritual perception within the Ethiopian Orthodox Täwaḥǝdo Church. Henceforth, I will use the acronym EOTC. This ancient Christian tradition has remained almost entirely independent from Western theology and philosophy for 1,700 years. This means it has mostly eschewed Western modes of systematic and abstract thinking in favor of more organic and embodied approaches that necessitate divine participation. Perceiving God by, quote, contemplating the Holy Trinity, which is Natsrota Selus Kidus on your handout as the final step. That idea is firmly established as the pinnacle of the Christian journey within the EOTC. This journey is punctuated by consistent progression in divine participation. Simply stated, it is not possible to perceive God without becoming like God. Although one may catch glimpses of God in direct ways, the pertinent question from the perspective of the Ethiopian Church, I'm arguing, is whether such direct perception is the most appropriate or the most honorable. Just as St. Paul exhorts his readers to imitate him as he imitates Christ, the EOTC classically prefers to emulate the embodied example of living monks rather than abstract or written examples that are not embodied. This paper is comprised of 4 sections, and I'll do my best to signal those as we move along. I hope to demonstrate that spiritual perception in the EOTC is always mediated, and that the mediation involved always entails some type of divine participation. Fundamentally, this reality increases the glory given to God and enhances spiritual progress or maturation of Christians. Now, that last sentence is very important because certain Protestants sometimes have concluded that any type of intermediaries detract from the glory given to God or act to stifle the growth of Christians in Christ likeness. So I hope to demonstrate just a few ways, I won't be comprehensive, how we might think about the cult of saints in a slightly different perspective, especially the perspective of the majority world, especially the cultural situation of Ethiopia. So my first section is entitled General Perception in Ethiopian Culture. I just want to talk about how people in Ethiopia tend to perceive things and understand the kind of metaphysical, metaphysics is a bad word. I should stay away from the Greek philosophical terms, but I just want to explore briefly some basics. Ethiopia boasts an impressive history stretching back into antiquity and is the only country in Africa that was never colonized. That's significant. As such, its cultural distinctives represent important counterweights to related norms in other parts of Africa and also those in Europe and the Middle East. For our purposes, some very brief observations will be made about perception, how it functions, in 3 different arenas. Those are the political, the aesthetic, and the supernatural. Okay, so I'm going to work my way through these general types of perception in Ethiopia. Like many other ancient societies, Ethiopia has long embraced stratified structures in its political systems, with iconic features such as the multi-layered court of the monarch being recorded in various literature. As a culture with a high presence of both honor, shame, and power, fear dynamics, this means that the necessary social distance between rulers and the ruled is understood at the most basic level of Ethiopian social consciousness. What makes Ethiopian political thought distinct, however, is its unique dependence upon the Solomonic dynasty as recorded in the national epic, the Kebra Nagust, or Glory of Kings. This work, some of you may be familiar with, records the Ethiopian version of the famous story of the Queen of Sheba in 2 Chronicles chapter 9, with the added detail that she bears a son for Solomon named Menelik, who visits his father in Jerusalem upon reaching adulthood, and then returns to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant. Consequently, an Ethiopian king was not only separated from commoners because of his power and honor, but most importantly because of his status as the rightful ruler of God's chosen people. However, just like the kings of ancient Israel, the king of Ethiopia was himself expected to submit to a certain level of mediation provided by the Ark. In the Kebra Nagast, the Ark is described or addressed rather in the following way. This is a quote. Be salvation to the plants and flowers. Be salvation, intercede and be merciful, and have regard for your people. End quote. This Ark theology has vital implications for the self-understanding of Ethiopian Orthodox Christians today, which we will discuss momentarily. The concept of mediated spiritual access is demonstrated in multiple ways. One simplistic example involves the self-selected distance of worshipers from the church building during the liturgy, much like how the people of Israel desired to distance themselves from the glory of the tabernacle, glory of God in the tabernacle. Further discussion beyond what I have time for right now, but the vital point I'm trying to make here is that perception of those in positions of authority in Ethiopia is indelibly shaped by understandings of honor, power, and mediation. In fact, it is commonly understood that mediators increase the honor given or distributed to all of the parties involved in an event or in an agreement. When it comes to aesthetic perception, now we're moving on to the second kind of type. Ethiopians place a very high value on variety and on symbolism. In my full written paper, I make some comparisons to Byzantine art, and I explain how the Ethiopian tradition has no official rules or formalization for its depiction of saints. I then discuss the classic example of this variety, which is called the Andumpta, the traditional Amharic biblical commentary. This commentary preserves what I like to call a harmonious tension by allowing differing and even contradictory interpretations to exist alongside each other. This tension is standard in many other places in the EOTC, including sacred manuscripts, where several different spellings and word choices are often used for an identical term on the same page of a manuscript. You can imagine or talk to Ralph about how frustrating that can be for people who are studying these manuscripts. Finally, this kind of emphasis on variety, aesthetic variety, suggests that the EOTC regards the variety and diversity as things that serve to enhance, actually, rather than confuse perception or comprehension. I think that's a very important point. And then finally, just a little bit on supernatural activity. Supernatural activity is universally regarded as ubiquitous in Ethiopia. This fact remains despite the influx of modern technologies and scientific education. In my extended paper, I discuss a very interesting genre of scripture, commonly known as the magic scrolls, more properly known as the Asmat rolls. But these are interesting because they're basically texts that deal with the exorcism of malevolent spiritual forces, I could say, or spiritual beings. And what they reveal, I think, is a vast entourage of divine forces and spiritual beings that are constantly involved in every aspect of daily life. Those of you familiar with other places in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, will also recognize a similar dynamic. Spiritual perception in terms of basic awareness is not difficult, but understanding the deeper dynamics of spiritual activity and how to navigate them successfully require discipline and intercession. Now I'm moving on to section number 2, which is simply titled The Role of Christ in the EOTC Tradition. The Role of Christ, section number 2. One of the most important issues impacting notions of spiritual perception in Ethiopia relates to ongoing debates about the intercessory role of Christ. This debate between Protestant and Orthodox groups traces its origin to early efforts of modern Bible translation, and it reached new heights in 2007 when the EOTC made some crucial decisions about how to translate key terms from Ge'ez, that is classical Ethiopic, into Amharic, that is the main modern language of Ethiopia. This debate has recently been described as, quote, the most controversial topic between the EOTC and the Ethiopian Protestants. This controversy centers on 2 biblical passages where the Greek term entugano is used. That should be on the back of your handout or on the second page of your digital handout. These passages are Romans 8:34 and Hebrews 7:25. Protestant translations of these texts into Amharic have followed the basic theological impulse to view Christ as an intercessor, primarily because of his actions, and have therefore used the Amharic term amalaj to convey this sense. The EOTC has strongly objected to this translation because in Ethiopian culture, an amalaj is normally understood as someone who begs for something on their knees. Hence, such behavior is seen as woefully inappropriate for the second person of the Trinity, who is understood more accurately as a temelaj, or one who receives intercession. So alternative terms have been chosen by the Orthodox Church in Ethiopia. The EOTC generally prefers to understand Christ's intercessory role in ontological and existential terms rather than in performative or even priestly terms. And an important passage here, which we could discuss later, I suppose, is 1 Timothy 2, verse 5, which talks about the one and only mediator between God and humanity. In the written paper, I also mention how John Chrysostom and Theodoret have very similar concerns about understanding Christ's intercession in these passages. Both of these figures felt that any type of supplication of the Son to the Father was unbecoming and unnecessary, since Christ had already, quote, shown human nature on the King's throne. Thereby, they conclude that the language of intercession used by Paul was an instance of condescension to help highlight God's love for our feeble human minds. Ultimately, if Christ is not the one to intercede for humanity with prayers, he's interceding ontologically in his person, then the natural place to direct prayers is among the saints, which is the subject of the next section. Section number three, the cult of saints in Ethiopia. While the cult of saints in the EOTC shares many basic similarities with other Orthodox traditions, it differs in some important ways. First, there is far less concern for relics of saints in the EOTC. Obviously, this has important implications for how Christians perceive divine power, divine potency, divine intervention. More important, there is a stronger emphasis on monastic saints in the EOTC. This is crucial, and there are at least two factors behind this. First of all, the inception of Christianity in Ethiopia did not begin amidst circumstances of persecution, which gave rise to the popularity of the so-called military saints throughout the Roman Empire, but rather as an influx of monks entered the land from Egypt and Syria in the 5th century. Second, Ethiopian Christians have not experienced regular persecution like related churches, i.e. the Coptic Church, which has long existed under the hegemony of Islam. Thus, although the transition from what's sometimes called red to white martyrdom never really took place in Ethiopia, the emphasis on ascetic struggle has been strong from the very beginning. For our purposes, I just want to divide the cult of saints in Ethiopia into 5 categories. This is a functional kind of division. At the very top, we have the Theotokos, the Waladita Amlak in Ge'ez, or Mary, the Mother of God. The next level down, we have the angels. Sometimes people of Protestant persuasions don't often think about the angels in terms of saintly intercession, but they're very important. Beneath the angels, we have kind of special personal saints. I'll discuss that more in a moment. Beneath them, the 4th level down, we have all other deceased saints. And then the very bottom, we have living monks who are the closest to normal Christians. And I'm going to suggest that the monastic dynamics and realities of Ethiopia strongly influence the way people understand spiritual growth or progress and how we can become closer to God and perceive God in deeper ways. So the Waladita Amlak, or the Theotokos, Mary, is without question the premier intercessor in the EOTC. One excellent example of the extent of her intercession is found in the Harp of Glory, which is a medieval lengthy acrostic work composed entirely in Ge'ez. In beautiful and creative language, this piece of literature describes how Mary intercedes for all of humanity by preparing the way for the incarnation. She is the oak of Mamre, the field of Arana, the workshop of the Spirit, the fiery chariot of the Godhead, the gate of paradise, the mountain of Ramatha, the flower of cinnamon and balsam, the month of peace, the wash bowl of purification, the sweet-smelling palm of Naphtali, and dozens more. Far from being an obstacle to the divine, the Theotokos fundamentally serves as an avenue or a bridge to intimacy with God. This greatly influences broader perception, spiritual perception, by reminding supplicants that by honoring the Mother of God, God himself receives great honor and glory. And of course, this is deeply interwoven in cultural understandings of community and family in Ethiopia, even if people talk about identity and what that means or how it's conceptualized, okay? The next level beneath the Theotokos is that of the angels. Thanks to the impact of Enochic literature, several different classes of angels are well recognized within the EOTC. Although Gabriel and Michael are some of the most common angels who are requested to intercede on behalf of Christians, there is also a strong connection to the Watchers of First Enoch. More on this in a moment. Again, it is readily acknowledged that the angels operate within the ultimate will of God, but that their powerful service also magnifies the power of God. Just as the centurion in the Gospels can give a command and have it fulfilled, humanity can perceive the extent of God's power by observing the power of his servants. Then in the paper, I talk a little bit about what I called personal saints, with whom people have different connections. So perhaps they were born on the saint's feast day, or they're given the saint's name at baptism, or they're in a certain occupation that is traditionally connected with different types of saints or what have you. But the final kind of subsection I want to talk about is that of the living monks and the profound influence they have in Ethiopia still today. I'll share just one important quote from a scholar called Stephen Kaplan, who wrote this about Ethiopian monks, quote, "Like the angels, the monastic holy man was recognized as a mediating figure, capable of reaching and influencing a distant God. I should also emphasize how highly active and visible Ethiopian monks are today, with well over 60,000 of them in over 800 active monasteries, many of whom function as spiritual fathers, advisors, teachers, and important social figures." The math is hard to do, but I think roughly I would estimate there are 4 to 5 times as many monks, active monks operating in Ethiopia than there are in Russia today, which has traditionally had a lot of monks. Excuse me. Ultimately, the saints in the Ethiopian tradition function both as practical models for holiness and also as real helpers who intercede along the way. What is more, saintly mediation is seen to facilitate both the honor of God and the capacity of humans to participate in the divine. Now we come to the last and most interesting section, which I have titled Divine Perception as Divine Participation. Section number 4, Divine Perception as Divine Participation. The idea of stages in the Christian journey has a long and a rich history within Christian and especially monastic literature. The pertinent point to be made here today is that the idea of stages is reinforced by cultural understandings of power and honor. That appropriate type of distance that we were discussing before, the idea that a mediator can increase the honor for the parties involved by ensuring that levels of status are maintained and respected and acknowledged. Thus, just as Ethiopian worshippers regularly distance themselves from church buildings, it seems that the spiritual steps express some type of degree of proximity to God, spiritually speaking. However, as we have seen already, spiritual progress in Ethiopia is not only situated within frameworks of mediated power and honor, it also exists within paradigms that are deeply practical and deeply embodied. Monks and other saints who attain deep perception of God are only able to do so after the culmination of struggles. I'm going to share a good example of this in a moment. It is vital to note, however, that such struggles are only overcome with the help and encouragement that is derived through reaching earlier levels of perception, earlier levels that involve increasing participation with God. Indeed, the entire journey of Christian progress is characterized by increasing marks of spiritual perception. So now, I won't talk about your handout a ton, but the most importantly articulated monastic paradigm in Ethiopia is known as the 10 steps of Adam. I've included on your handout a what would you call it? A work in progress. It's not perfect yet. It's not exactly proprietary information, but I would ask that you don't circulate it everywhere because it's work in progress. This paradigm, the 10 steps of Adam, features many familiar elements of asceticism, such as silence and tears and self-control. It is important to observe, however, that the paradigm begins and it ends with different types of perception. So we have basic spiritual awareness being involved with the first step, okay? The awareness that there are angels, that there are other spiritual beings, there are saints interceding. But then the final step is contemplation of the Holy Trinity, natrota selus kudus, okay? Thus, while beginning ascetics do not immediately experience the glory of the beatific vision, they still experience a real and significant level of spiritual perception. The Christian must therefore build upon increasing degrees of divine participation in order to attain greater degrees of divine perception. Perhaps most evocatively, the penultimate state of becoming fire conveys the need to be transformed before one can fully behold God. If my argument is sound, one would expect to find language about divine participation deeply interwoven throughout the literature of the EOTC. While technical terms such as theosis, deification, and sanctification are common in other Christian traditions, these words bear no exact equivalent in the Ge'ez language. Rather, we find a rich and wide variety of indigenous nouns, verbs, phrases, and metaphors that are used to describe things like theosis, or spiritual growth, progress, participation. And this is especially true in monastic texts. I will now share 6 of these terms to demonstrate both the practical and embodied ways that spiritual perception is related to divine participation, and how the cult of the saints functions in that process. 3 of these terms are quite well known within the EOTC, while the latter 3 are relatively less known. The first term is Täwaḥǝdo, which you have on your handout, I think, which means oneness, union, or unity. This word is best known as the technical term used to describe the Christology of the EOTC, but is also used to describe the aim of divine participation. The main importance of this term for spiritual perception has to do with mystery. Like the early Syriac tradition to which the EOTC is broadly connected, the Ethiopian tradition has eschewed precise theological definitions because it believes that they act to limit or constrain the infinite. Thus, the EOTC is content to use Täwaḥǝdo in reference to Christ's nature, without attempting to clarify or parse the mystery. Analogously, a Christian can truly experience and know God without necessarily being able to articulate the mechanics, or even being able to knowingly perceive God. Furthermore, building on this mystery, there is a sense that Christian solidarity and fellowship with the saints, both the living and the deceased saints, is inextricably involved in the process of becoming one with God, just as Jesus seems to hint in his prayer in John chapter 17. A second instructive term relating to spiritual perception, participation, and the cult of saints is gudel, which means spiritual fight or struggle. This term is best known as the title for the hagiographical lives of the saints, but therefore it also implies that the ideal for Christian holiness in the EOTC involves an inevitable level of ascetic struggle. Some of the most important examples of this spiritual struggle are John the Baptist and Saint Stephen, the proto-martyr, both of whom were martyred shortly after attaining a new level of understanding about who God is in Christ, which the commentaries and the expert commentators in the Ethiopian tradition claim is the last step on your paradigm, contemplating the Holy Trinity. Okay, so John the Baptist and Stephen both achieved or reached or attained this level of spiritual participation and perception right before they were martyred. Crucially, Stephen can contemplate the Holy Trinity only after being filled with the Holy Spirit. That's Acts chapter 7. Indeed, a major monastic text called the Aragawi Memphisawi describes this basic and this blessed contemplation as, quote, the crown which Christ gives to his beloved ones at the consummation of their struggles, end quote. And that's a description which carries some very strong and obvious overtones of martyrdom with the crown. It is rather startling, in fact, that one of the daily prayers of the EOTC explicitly asks that God would make the supplicant stand on Judgment Day with Stephen, the martyr, and with John the Baptist. Only the pure in heart will see God, but only those who suffer with Christ and with his saints can attain a pure heart. The third well-known term that relates to divine participation as perception is tabot, which means ark or dwelling place or box, as defined by a scholar called Wolf Leslau, but its deeper spiritual meaning is expressed by an Ethiopian scholar called Kidana Waldekifle as the mystery of divine presence and indwelling. Because every church in the EOTC prominently features a tabot that contains the Eucharistic elements during the liturgy, conceptions of ark theology are deeply ingrained in the consciousness of worshipers. Fascinating translation cements divine indwelling as both the salvific goal for the church, but also the mission of the church for the world. Hence, tabot is used in 1 Peter 2, verse 9, so that instead of holy priesthood, Christians are defined as a royal nation and a tabot, singular, for the king. Just as Christ is understood to accomplish his mission of mediation through his very being, it seems that the Christian vocation in the EOTC is less about particular deeds and more about increasing union with God. We saw earlier that the Kabbalah and the Gust describes how the ark is meant to mediate salvation to all of creation. Now, Christians themselves, as a tabot collectively, accomplish that mediation insofar as they attain to the mystery of divine indwelling. Now we come to a lesser known term connected with spiritual perception, but one that is profoundly intimate and embodied. The word is sa'ama, which simply means to kiss. In the Ethiopic Synkasar, that is the Synaxarion, there are numerous examples of God kissing saints at the culmination of their struggles, often on the mouth. Such saints include John of Heracli, Abba Masael, Abba Bula Habib, and the Waladita Amlak. Perhaps most illustrative is the language used in the life or the Gödel, the struggle of a saint called Abuna Gebra Memphis. It's a little bit longer of a quote. After this, God, being revealed to him in glory as at the transfiguration, our Lord Jesus Christ lifted up Abuna Gebra Memphis in the same way that he lifted Peter out of his fear on Mount Tabor, and our Lord embraced him and kissed him on his mouth. The Father and the Holy Spirit embraced him and kissed him, because this man abounds in his struggle. That is Gödel. This passage exemplifies the way that divine participation and divine perception are fundamentally linked in the EOTC, much like the mysterious unity of Christ's being, Christ's nature. Another lesser known term is tagah, which means vigilance or watchfulness. This term is often used of desert fathers and ascetics, including Arsenius, Macarius, and Yared. More significantly, this is also the term used for the watchers in 1 Enoch, which is a cherished text of the EOTC. It is no accident, therefore, that one major tradition of interpretation understands the fallen angels to be proto-monastics who failed in their calling by succumbing to worldly temptations. That is, they were not vigilant. Because monks in Ethiopia are expressly trained with the purpose of being like the angels as they intercede with and through prayers for the world, the practice of watchfulness seems to be one of the main ways that this is achieved. It is also significant that one of the stages in the 10 steps of Adam is achieving vision like that of the angels. And finally, the last term, and then we'll move into a conversation. Final noteworthy term for this discussion is tsamada, which means to be yoked with, as in the yoke of a pair of oxen. This term is consistently used to translate ascesis, the Greek term normally translated as something like exercise or discipline, in whenever it appears in the Sinkhasar. And it is often paired with a form of gudel, rendering the common phrase that a saint was an ascetic and a fighter or a struggler. This term also appears in several surprising places in the biblical texts, perhaps most importantly in the Gospels, when Jesus instructs his disciples to follow him. So in the Ethiopic text of the Gospels, Jesus says, "Come and be yoked with me." This is a very Semitic idea. The rabbinical Second Temple literature talks a great deal about the yoke of the law, and then that's carried on into the early Syriac traditions as well. This terminology of yoking has multiple implications for spiritual perception, but once again emphasizes the importance of participation, especially through shared suffering. Whereas the notion of following Christ can sometimes be construed with the sort of distance that typified Jewish disciples eating the dust of their rabbi, right? Being yoked involves an unavoidable closeness, parity, and shared movement. Simply stated, God's people cannot move towards God if they are still yoked in the metaphorical servitude of Egypt. And that is the clear implication of the Exodus narrative in the Ethiopic scriptures, where this exact word, tsamada, is used. That brings me to the end of my formal talk, and I'd love to have some dialogue about all of these things I've shared. Thank you.
If you're online, you raise your hand. It'll hopefully tell us that you're ready to ask a question. But
yeah, so if you go down to the reaction button at the bottom and you click on that, it'll come raise hand. And if we see that, then we already have a hand raised.
Irene's just put it down again, yeah?
I have a question.
Please.
Oh, yes, she is there. She wants to ask.
Irene, go ahead.
Irene, go ahead, yeah.
Sorry, no, I don't have a question. I was just trying to find out where that button was. My apologies. I'm using a different phone.
You answered your own question, Irene. So go ahead, Sarah.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been really good and inspiring talk with lots of interesting concepts. And however, my question is, while you were talking, especially the beginning of your talk, I'm not expert in Orthodoxy, but I just read a few things here and there. While you were talking, I was also imagining in my mind the other Orthodox churches within the Middle East, especially the Coptic Church and the church, let's say even Assyrian Church. And there are lots of similarities. What you were, Riyadh, please do correct me. There are lots of similarities with what you were saying and with some of the Orthodox Church in the Middle East. Yet you didn't mention, you only emphasized strongly that is Ethiopian Orthodox Church or these things. Is that your way, or are you claiming that there are not much similarity, or they haven't influenced that. And especially, for example, when we know the Ethiopian Orthodox Church get its independence from the Coptic Church in 1915, not really long ago, and how much of this interdependency or dependency within the Coptic Church, especially from the leadership point of view, has influenced all those things you were talking about. And then how much of it is unique to the Ethiopian Church. That is what I didn't get. Is that,
okay? Yeah, I understand your question. Thank you. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear enough. My basic conviction is that there are similarities, and the difference is one of degree, not of kind. And of course, there are many similarities between the Coptic, especially the Coptic tradition, and the Ethiopian tradition. The recent autocephaly of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, however, is a bit deceptive, because really the Ethiopian Church developed in a lot of its own ways, not completely separate or isolated. This is something that Ralph and I talk about quite a bit, but we have just, I mean, dozens, if not hundreds, of texts and liturgical features and artistic forms and conventions and everything. If you look at the Coptic Church and the Ethiopian Church, they are different. Regarding the cult of saints, and I think I did mention that there are similarities, but again, I think there's a difference in degree because of how Ethiopian culture has developed. It was insulated, we might say, not isolated, but strongly insulated, or there was a buffer between the Mediterranean world and the Greek philosophical thinking and everything like that. So I would argue that the especially Greek philosophical thinking and components of Western culture and other things have simply entered into other traditions to a greater extent than they have in the Ethiopian tradition. In a lot of ways, the Ethiopian tradition represents something that is I mean, there are just so many features that I didn't have time to talk about. The traditional church education system has been described as the oldest in the entire world, and there's nobody else that really does it like they do, and they have this amazing way of composing extemporaneous kind of aphorisms and spiritual insights. So just to reiterate, there are certainly connections, absolutely. They're not different in kind, they're just a difference in degree. And I think that if we look at the Ethiopian church, I think other Orthodox churches could learn, because if you go to a country like Greece, right? Greece is quite a modern place in many areas, and there are many features of Greek society and culture today that would be familiar, to other people from the West. Whereas Ethiopian culture, if you go there today, linguistically, philosophically, culturally, socially, all these things, it's something different. And I think the communal aspects and the ways that they perceive things naturally provide some exciting opportunities for how we can kind of interpret or understand or even promote, I would say, promote the cult of saints. Sorry for the long-winded answer. I hope that helps.
Yes, I have one more question then. Can I?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Okay.
Follow on. Yeah.
Sorry. Actually, you may not have answered to my question. And it is in relation to the Täwaḥǝdo and the concept. It's also, I'm just thinking, the connection between the Tawhid in Islam and Täwaḥǝdo in Ethiopian, and how, because interestingly, I mean, I like to really read more about it. And because the oneness within the Tawhid in Islam it seems very, right. It is similar to Täwaḥǝdo in and even in just briefly, I read an article a few years ago about even some of the old scholars, maybe 3 or 4 old scholars of Islam, were thinking Tawhid doesn't mean only the oneness in the sense of one, and that you can debate the concept of Trinity, but by the Trinity, they didn't mean the Trinity of Christianity. But it
Right.
was when you, I mean, it is interesting. I don't know whether
It
you
is.
have any answer to that, but it is interesting
No,
research.
I've had this question before. It is fascinating. I think it is important to think about. I think I would like to answer slightly, not provocatively, but with a simple kind of perspective or something to keep in mind, is that the word Täwaḥǝdo appears in Ethiopic texts that were written and composed and existing before Islam ever existed or as a religion. So if there is similarity, there might be back and forth, there might be a mutual influence throughout the course of history, I'm not sure, but we can't forget that fact that Ethiopian Christianity far predates the entire religion of Islam, and the language of Ge'ez predates the modern language of Arabic. And so we shouldn't, because some people have wanted to jump to conclusions about the influence coming from Islam into Ethiopian Christianity. And so at least we need to remember that there's at least an equal, if not stronger, argument for the influence going the other way. That's what I would say. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm not really sure what else I can add to your question, but it is important, and I do recognize it. Yeah.
No, the reason I say that, because I don't think Islam claims the concept of Tawhid. Islam claims the development of the concept of Tawhid rather than the concept of Tawhid. I think that is the fascinating things about it. That is, what do you mean? I mean, it is how that developed and how sorry about that. It's just something I'm thinking. I don't have answer.
I'm going to raise my hand.
Yes.
Well, let me see what Ralph has to say about that.
It's a technical point, really, that the grammatical form of the word Täwaḥǝdo, it's what you would call as a one another verb. So the basic verb has been changed with an addition of a t and then the a vowel in the middle, and necessarily it's a one another verb. So a verb of that form with the t at the beginning and the extra a vowel, Täwaḥǝdo, it means one thing uniting with another.
Yes,
which is
and I think
slightly different from the.
There's also something to be said for Muslims and Christians in Ethiopia. I don't think see as much similarity there as we might as from the outside, because, and one piece of evidence to that point, I think, is that we mentioned the recent, autocephaly, the fact that the EOTC has become its own church in the 20th century. At that point in time, they decided to name themselves the Ethiopian Orthodox Täwaḥǝdo Church. So this term is in the title of the church. And if they were concerned about everybody thinking, oh, that's just a Muslim idea or something, I don't think they would have chosen that term to describe their ancient Christian tradition. That's just a thought. So there are some differences. There are similarities too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You had a question next, and then you next.
Thank you, Ralph, for calling on me, and Calum,
yeah.
Yes, thank you for your presentation last week and this week. My question is similar to Sarah's in terms of Täwaḥǝdo and their Christology. So I've read some of the critique of the EOTC's Christology, that a lot of people don't actually believe that Jesus was fully human or genuinely human. And I'm wondering if that's true, and if that is true, then does that explain that kind of really high Christology that lacks the humanity of Christ, or the full humanity, explain the existential need for an intercessor or for the cult of saints?
Could you repeat the last sentence or two? I just was looking at this thing in the chat, which I'll have to read more fully. I apologize.
Yeah, sorry. If in terms of the Christology, if their Christology is so high and they don't believe that Jesus was genuinely human, does that explain the existential need for the cult of saints? And does that explain some of the reasons why evangelicals or other Protestants have tried to explain their Christology away from that term of Täwaḥǝdo in Ethiopia?
I see. Great question. Yeah, I understand. So, I mean, absolutely, that is a common and a well-known kind of point that's raised or accusation. And I think in every church, there's always going to be lay people or practitioners who are doing things that, let's say, fall short of the doctrinal standards that the church leaders would hope that they're doing, or how they're doing these things. It's a common. I have this conversation often when I'm talking with Protestants or even my parishioners about veneration of icons or worship of icons, and so that's there. But I feel an obligation to speak from the texts that I've studied, the monastic texts that I've studied, and I don't see strong indicators that there was a Christology displayed in these texts, the cherished texts of the church, that was somehow less than suggesting that Christ was less than fully human. I don't find that in those texts. I think that idea probably circulates, and there are some groups that may have that idea, but I don't think it's correct to claim that is a firm position that the church has advanced, if that makes sense. And then as for the cult of saints, this is very interesting because the issue I talked about with the Amalaj and the Temalaj, this debate between the Orthodox and the Protestants, is Christ. There's agreement that Christ intercedes for us. But the question is, what does that intercession mean? And I think that maybe there is, well, certainly there is a sense that in that intercessory role, if it is unbecoming, if it is viewed as an unbecoming behavior for Christ to, get on his knees and pray to God the Father, then there's a certain, man, I want to say something like the divine nature of Christ is higher, but the human nature of Christ is not diminished, or something like that. It's complex, and I'm not sure I'm the most qualified scholar to answer your question, but we should talk more about it. And actually, I did something on that handout that I've decided not to do now. I defined the term Täwaḥǝdo, and I've decided from conversations with many monks and leading church scholars that actually it's not best to define that term rigidly, because it's a mysterious term, or it speaks to the mystery of the incarnation. And to try to parse it completely and say this is exactly what it means, I think somehow takes away from or diminishes the mystery and the profound, unprecedented event of the incarnation. Sorry again for rambling, but thank you for your question. It's spot on, very important.
Hello, I am Claire. My interest in learning a little bit more about Orthodoxy Christianity is to see how some of its teachings and understanding can speak into a Buddhist context, because in the Buddhist context they do venerate the ancestors, and they do supplicate towards spirit beings, which probably you may call saints, because these spirit beings were also originally human, right? So I'd like two questions, if I may ask. Firstly, how does the understanding of the cult of saints speak into how Christians can understand the communion of saints and the cloud of witnesses? Do you know what I mean? So that's my first question. And my second question is, before Christianity came to Ethiopia, was there already a practice of interacting with spirit beings? And was that in some ways contextualized when Ethiopia became Christian?
Okay, great. Thank you. So regarding the great cloud of witnesses, I would probably say that's a reference to in a way, the cult of saints, or I mean, that word cult is not great. That's just what it's called in the academic field. But this idea that there have been Christians who've gone before us, who have lived faithful lives, who now are closer to God than we are now. I'm trying to use language that bridges Protestant and Orthodox circles here. I'm not accurately representing either one very well. But yeah, I think there's been a rich understanding of the continuation of the saints and fellowship with these Christians who have been departed from their body, and difficulties come, as we all know. I don't need to do a theology class, but Martin Luther and the other reformers caused a break there, and so I think there's some questions about the afterlife and what happens that need to be considered. But if you believe in soul sleep, then the cult of saints isn't really possible, because everybody is just kind of snoozing until the final judgment. So it is deeply dependent on a certain understanding of what happens to people after they die. And in Africa, in the African continent, I'm not claiming by saying this that Ethiopia culture is exactly like the rest of sub-Saharan culture, but I live in Kenya. And of course, in Kenya, we have a very strong tradition of doing things for and because of ancestors. And I think that probably the idea of being connected to ancestors who have gone before us is probably more representative of how most humans have lived than it is of it's been the exception of the anomaly in history, I think, in the last in the modern period, when people have stopped believing something like that. As for your second question, I'm trying to remember what it was. Could you remind me, please?
Whether the cult of saints was there a practice that predates Christianity? Right.
So we know that there was worship happening in Ethiopia before Christianity got there. There are some competing claims. One claim, well, we don't need to be competing. We know that there were temples to what we would call pagan deities. The sun, the moon, and the sun were being worshipped in Ethiopia at some point before Christianity. But of course, if Menelik, the son of Queen of Sheba and Solomon, came to Ethiopia and they were worshiping Yahweh, that was also happening. But my most important answer that I want to stick with comes from the hagiographical texts of the saints who came to Ethiopia, and they encounter malevolent spiritual beings in caves and in trees and in wells and in serpents. And so those things are causing fear, and they are subjecting people to do things because of them. And the saints are able to cast out or conquer those malevolent spiritual beings in the name of Christ and demonstrate the power of Christ and the legitimacy of Christianity. So those stories are found throughout the lives of the saints, because they are bringing in the power and the victory of Christ over the spiritual forces that have held people in bondage. We should probably address the question in the chat. Ralph, am I allowed to look at that?
Yeah, I did notice that one. Sorry. One from Salawi.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
It's
point
not,
in the
it's
chat.
not the question, actually. It's not a question.
It's a
just
I also quoted from encyclopedia about what EOTC is.
Yeah.
because I mentioned in my paper this word. Just yeah, but if I am allowed, can I?
Oh yeah, of course.
That was very
Yeah,
sneaky, but yes.
yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, actually,
Chat on screen so people can
when
see.
I was very little, I was Orthodox Christianity believer. Now I am in evangelical denomination. You mentioned two very important things: divine participation and also intercession of the saints, and both the dead and the one who are living. Have you tried to see the intercession or ammalaj from the perspective of divine participation? Because that is, I think, linked in my perspective. I don't know whether you mentioned about Kidan. Kidan is promise, and the Orthodox believers believe that
Yes.
God has promised to be reached through Mary or other angels.
Right.
I think a lot of scholars have mentioned that. Have you seen any connection between the intercession and divine participation? There is a famous saying, the Orthodox believers say, even in our salvation, we have to participate. It's not only what God has done enough. Rather, we have to participate through our offerings, our prayers. That is also one big juncture for division between the evangelicals and Orthodox people. If you can comment on that.
Thank you. I think I understand your question. And I should confess, I'm not an expert in the modern, necessarily the modern debates and dynamics of Orthodoxy in Ethiopia. So I would like to answer, or I'd like to provide a perspective from the text I study, the Ge'ez text that I study. And I think it's safe to say in other traditions, in the Coptic tradition, I'm saying because I know Riyadh is in the room, the saints and the activities that the monks are doing in the desert was never regarded by people in the cities as something problematic. They were so thankful that these people were out in the desert praying for them and acting as examples and doing everything they could to grow in holiness and to grow in faithfulness. And so I think in my understanding, there's an interesting change or shift in thinking when we view the saints as an obstacle, something that we have to get through to get to God. Because my reading of most of the monastic texts is that they have been a group that wants to help us get closer to God, and people have visited monks for the entire history of Christianity, well, since monasticism began, to ask for advice and to ask for prayers. And some of the earlier research I've done focusing on monks in Egypt, I think that the how would I say this? The transition between a living monastic and then a somebody who dies and becomes someone who is regarded as a saint is that transition is hardly even there. It's like there's no separation there. The people who we look up to and want to emulate, like Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. It's just a change in where they are operating from. They're no longer with us here in the monastery. They have gone on, and so we have some strong evidence that a lot of icons were made quite shortly after monks and leaders in monastic communities were deceased, and so there was a connection and there was a bond, and people have felt, I'm strongly convinced of this, for a very long time, that they are able to connect with God in a better way because the saints are praying with them and helping them pray and inspiring them. And so I think the Protestant, it's a very classic Protestant concern, and I think it needs to be considered. And Martin Luther and the others were certainly correct in highlighting some problematic assumptions that had come to take root. But if we're okay with people praying for us now, if I ask you to pray to God for me, and then you die and you go somewhere else, and I ask you to continue praying for me wherever you are, then fundamentally that's not a change in the existential, hierarchy. I would say it's just a change of how these people are functioning now. This community of Christians, some of whom have died, and some of whom are still living. I know that I haven't addressed your question directly, and again, I'm not an expert in the modern dynamics and the arguments that the Ethiopian Church is going through. I'm trying to give an answer that I think reflects the monastic texts, the Ethiopic monastic texts that I study. So take it for what it's worth. But thank you for your question. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So one question from Riyadh, and then one from Tom over here as well. So.
Thank you, Calum. It's really interesting to hear someone without Orthodox background and speaks about this complicated topic.
Yeah,
I found it fascinating. Yeah. So I just have a comment, and maybe a question, so you can clarify what I heard from Sarah and Kyle. Wes. That this idea is your resources from which you can say this is now the line is very thin between formal and popular face of the Täwaḥǝdo Church. And if you can explain it so they can understand it a bit as the Catholics, the Orthodox Church, especially Coptic Ethiopic churches, they don't have the magisterium or they don't have a bar to write the church dogmatics or this kind of thing.
Neither do I.
So I think this would make this a bit easier when questions comes, do they believe in this? And the generalization comes in a sense that we are waiting for a systematic theology to come out, but the question comes from a different resource, like it's more
correct.
It's more
organic is the word I use.
And, however, and the line between what is the core of the faith, what is not, because these people died for their faith throughout the history.
Correct.
So the line still, there is a line somewhere,
yes,
a blurry line between both. One of which is the Mephizite nature of Christ. This is undisputable for them. They would die for it, thousands, it don't matter. So, and this what I wanted to ask, do they teach these kind of things about the saints, teach it verbally, or they keep writing it over and over, or it's by practice, families are not used to this, and spiritual fathers are not used to this, so it's more of a popular, or it's written now, it's still taught. This one thing. The other thing that it was very interesting. I was waiting actually from Claire to ask something, because when you have to speak more, by the way, what your way of reading and praying the prayers, the Ethiopic prayers, is something with her methodology. So I found it very interesting. But what is related to was there a previous understanding of this? They call it cult of saints. I don't know if you can tell me how is it in Ethiopia, but from Egypt it already existed in the ancient Egyptian religion for thousands of years, and they were very close to, let's say, Nubia, Kush, Ethiopia, this area. So it moved to Christianity, but now they can intercede with the right people. And Muslims continue in Egypt as well, interceding with saints, by the way.
In Iran, they too.
So the idea is there like thousands of years, I believe, but I don't know if it's the same or they had their own way. But you said Kenya, so if Kenya and Egypt have it, of course Ethiopia would have it, right, in the middle. So Yeah, and you said it very well, and I think also many people would say that Jesus is not jealous from his children, right? If someone asks his children something, he's not jealous of this. So yeah, if you can just say something about these 2 points.
Okay, so the first one, you're asking how people are taught about the saints. Is that what you're asking?
So yes, between the formal and the popular base, and how you get your resources from, so you can say that this is the Ethiopian belief or the church.
So I mean, there's the Synaxarion, which is read all the time in church, and people are hearing about the lives of saints. I think that's very formative. Of course, there are images. Ethiopia is a very iconographically rich place. I mean, even in restaurants, you see images of the saints all over the place. And I think different regions, because of famous monasteries who have particular saints connected to those monasteries, feel a closer connection to some of those saints. So you'll see a lot of, images of saints if you're near Debradamo that are connected to that monastery. But another thing that's very interesting is the literacy rates of Ethiopia and the amount of these hagiographic texts that you can find on the streets everywhere. So you can easily pick up the life of Stephen, the life of John, the life of Abuna Gebra Memphis Kadus. I mean, very, very easily. And people read them and they're very interested in them. They have been translated from Ge'ez into Amharic. So most people not trained in the church language are reading them in Amharic. And I'm not sure. I feel very inadequate about trying to guess about how consistent and how coherent the teachings are about these. Well, actually, I know for a fact that people have different ideas about the saints depending on where you are, because I've heard different stories. The saint I mentioned, we've talked about him a bit, Riyadh. Abuna Gebra Memphis Kadus, right? So in some of his iconography, he's covered in something. And so I've heard multiple people tell me that is hair, body hair, that God caused miraculously to grow because to keep him safe from the elements. But then other people have said, no, they're feathers. They're these feathers of a bird that represent so his name, Abuna Gebra Memphis Kadus, means servant of the Holy Spirit. And so the Holy Spirit as a dove, these feathers. So this gets to the point of what I was saying. I just briefly mentioned the emphasis placed on variety. The Ethiopian church is very comfortable with all of these things existing in the biblical commentary, right? You have contradictory comments about a biblical passage. So they're not as concerned about different versions of the life of a saint existing. So I don't know how that information is communicated. I don't think there's any standard organized systematic approach to conveying that information about the saints. Your second question, sorry, I forgot. Can you just remind me quickly what it was?
Just a comment, or I wonder if the Egyptian ancient religion would have this influence, or is said the traditional religions in Kenya, they have this, so maybe this was influencing the relationship between the living here and the living.
Oh, I see. Well, as I kind of suggested, I think, this might be like a phenomenological approach to religion or something, but I think it's a lot of sociologists or anthropologists rather would feel comfortable with saying that people around the world have done things to remember or to honor or to venerate or at times, worship ancestors that have died, right? And I think, Christianity redeems a lot of things about, pagan culture. I think we don't talk enough. It's my opinion about the Eucharist. So a sacrifice in the Old Testament, and for all ancient, pagan cultures, you kill something or you take something and you give it to the god so that the god can be nourished or smell something that's pleasing. But Christ gives us his body, right? So Christ takes this very well-known thing across the ancient world and says, no, I'm actually going to give you for nourishment myself. And so it turns upside down. And I think something similar, a dynamic is happening in the Christian cult of saints. It's taking an understanding. Human beings naturally want to remember and be connected with their loved ones. I think that's a natural impulse that God has put in our hearts, and I think we want to be connected with them. We want to see them again. And the Christian cult of saints has said, yes, this is how it's working, because we are going to be reunited again in the new Jerusalem and the new heaven, the new earth. But we have to remember that we have a fight to fight. There's a struggle. We have a job to do, and we can be involved in this together as we are praying from different sides of bodily existence or wherever we want to say that the saints are right now. So I think there's a very strong argument to be made, going back to the comment about Buddhism. There's something deeply within us as human beings that wants to be connected to the people that we've known and we've loved. And I think the Orthodox traditions give us a way to do that in a Christian sense. The saints should never be going back to the formal doctrine versus the outworkings in lay situations. We never worship the saints. We venerate the saints. We worship God. We don't even worship the Mother of God. We venerate the Theotokos. We worship God. Those things are different. But if we keep those ideas correct, and we have to have a robust understanding of what honor and shame is. Many Westerners don't have those paradigms, that structure. But if we honor the saints, I think we can give honor to God, show honor, and I think it can be a good thing.
Can I add just a brief comment, just to say, in terms of material evidence, as opposed to, I think what you just said is absolutely spot on, Calum, in terms of what must have been there. In terms of material evidence, we don't know anything about pre-Christian religion in Ethiopia. So there's a great temple at Iha up in Tigray. We have no idea what the religion was that was practiced in that temple. There are clearly places where sacrifices were made, there were inscriptions, but it doesn't connect with anything that we know. So it's difficult in terms of, to make a connection, say with Egyptian, something very specific. We just don't have the evidence. We have pointers. The sun and the moon were on the coins just before the king became a Christian, and the cross appears on afterwards. So likely the sun and the moon were there, the stellium axum, all those sorts of things. They point us, but we don't actually have any other content. So that's what I want to say. Tom, you had a question.
Yeah, Calum, that's kind of a strange question. I would go too off base, but one of the things that we notice, especially in terms of how we think about faith and those sorts of matters, especially as Protestant missionaries and in our modern world, is we tend to separate the spiritual from the material. And that things in terms of at least evangelical conversion and conversion in the 20th century, we want to convert from a series of physical objects that have ontological significance and actually extend blessing or curses and that kind of thing to rather a matter of ideas and decisions and frameworks like that. And so there's also a scene as the past is seen as primitive, that was seen as in touching and feeling and all those kinds of things that had ontological touch with that divine world, to now a world of ideas and shapes and ideas and knowledge. And so the question I want to ask in that regard is, if you're going to move more into a more ancient sense of how things refer in terms of mediation and God and how we connect with God, how do those rites and how do those physical expressions and touches of the physical objects serve as mediators through the ontological sense of the saint to Christ, not just sense of honor or an idea of the saint and how they model the saint, but an actual union that's ontologically brought about through the ritualistic practices.
Wow, it sounds like are you asking about relics?
Well, yeah, everything in terms of when you go to an Orthodox church or that kind of thing, there's the physical saint, there's the physical icon, and that is literally a physical bridge into the divine world. It's a window in a sense, and we Westerners have a very hard time getting our head around that because we are people of the mind, of reflection. I'm just wondering, you know, what are the issues within Orthodoxy in terms of that and how we think about those?
Yeah. So I made a brief point about how the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it's interesting, they don't really have as much of an emphasis on relics as other Orthodox traditions. There are some relics, they do have them in some places, but in my assessment, it's not nearly the same degree. And I think this is my theory, it's a working theory. There aren't that many monks left in Greece, for instance, or in Russia that you find just walking around the city anymore. But if you go to Addis Ababa or another large city, you will see monks just walking all over on the sidewalks, and priests, and people will kneel down and kiss their knees, and they will be blessed by the cross, and they will receive blessings, and they will receive advice from these monks in their daily lives. And so, oh man, I mean, relics have always been, or not always, but you know, in the medieval period, you know, relics were very common, and there was a slightly different these things called eulogia, or blessings. So the stylite monks who lived on the pillars, people would go and visit them. They would receive a little clay medallion with a picture of the monk, and we have tons of these remaining. I think I saw a lot of them in a museum in Cairo at one point. And so I think what I want to say is that the physical dimension, I like how you use the word bridge, it's embodied actually in people, I would say. And you go to the monasteries, and they don't need as many relics because they have so many monks who are these living examples. And like I hinted, they are sometimes called to be mediators in disagreements that are happening in the cities. They are brought in to give blessings, or people travel hours and hours to rural places on the top of mountains to meet with a monk or a spiritual leader who's almost the saint. You know, they're very old, they have the big gray beard, they're so close to God, you know, any day they're going to be passing away probably. And so if you're embracing, I mean, literally embracing and kissing and hugging and being blessed and hearing these words and these types of things, I think, and it's my hunch that is the kind of locus, that's the bridge. And I mean, these physical human beings who are embodied images, icons of Christ, then they die, and then they go somewhere, and then we remember them, and then maybe if we want to remember them, we produce an icon, or we ask them to continue praying for us. So, I mean, I'm still working through it, but I think that's the most kind of organic way. I think that's kind of the connection there, and I like, the reason I like that is because many saints, you know, we have patron saints. So Demetrius is the patron saint of Thessaloniki, right? His mosaic is there in the church if you go and visit it. But nobody today living in Thessaloniki knew or interacted with Demetrius, right? That's so long ago. Whereas in Ethiopia, saints are remembered and their lives are produced, and you'll see their picture. And people actually knew these guys. They went and visited them. I've heard stories about, you know, somebody who was struggling to have a birth, and then the monk is called, and then they have a miraculous birth, and then this child is right here. It's just very interwoven and integrated kind of memory that is held within the people rather than held within texts or held within objects. That I think that's what I want to say. I don't know how much, Ralph. I'm struggling to articulate something that is very amazing to me.
Very difficult, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard because we tend to be very cerebral.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I think one of the things when you climb into this, you see there's other ways of existence.
Yes.
That tend to see a spiritual world all around and infused, that you touch, and you touch the divine. And I think, anyways, many in the West are trying to capture that through global Pentecostalism and others to try to get back to something that's been so distanced. And I think even with your work in Vastu, it's real. It's not just a thought of something sacred. It's to walk into the sacred.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway.
So is it okay to pray to Billy Graham?
Well, yeah, we'll see that. Well, center.
Well, so an important point here. I tried to make this distinction, but we don't pray to the saints. We ask the saints to pray for us, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
prayers are directed to God. Now it gets tricky. language fails us, because if Billy Graham is somewhere and I'm communicating or I'm asking him, that feels like prayer to a lot of people who haven't done this before. But prayer is for God. We pray to God only, and we ask the saints to intercede. We ask them to pray to God for us, or to pray to God with us as we are praying as well.
Well, what I would say though, in answer and partly to you, Wes, is that we need to distinguish between just describing the world people inhabit and then different ways of perceiving that, and whether one way is better than another. It has been the perception of many Protestant missionaries that ontological touch has to be divided. But the problem with that is what a lot of researchers have showed too, is that's where the secular world comes in too, and says you can leave your local faith at the doorstep because we don't need that. All right. So there's a movement in terms of Protestantism to secularism that we need to think very deeply about, in terms of whether that creates a further separation that has led to a Western world that is almost divorced of faith. So there's a lot of interesting questions here. I don't have the answers, but that's what we're looking.
We did research for, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are we? Oh, we've got one more question from Damon up here.
Question. I'm just reading the chats about the relationship between the Ethiopian Orthodox Täwaḥǝdo Church, and it used to be under administration of Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria. The reason for leaving is because they do not agree with the Chalcedon formula about the two nature or one nature of Christ. Now, as far as I remember, the Cyril of Alexandria is quite in favor of kind of one nature of Christ, that somehow combining. And so maybe I misunderstood, but if the church in Egypt and Alexandria is favorable to mere physitism, why would the Orthodox Church want to leave that church because of that issue? Because I thought they were quite similar on that ground.
No.
Oh yeah, so you're right, there is a lot of similarity, but in the Orthodox churches, the ability to be autocephalous and govern has a lot to do with, well, issues of language is one thing. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been conducting liturgy in Ge'ez, while the Coptic Church has been conducting the liturgy in Coptic. And so over centuries and centuries, that produces liturgical forms and standards that are quite different from each other. And so there were some tensions. There's a good article that Ralph can send to people about the back and forth. There's power struggles because it's political. There are political issues involved. But I think if we were to speak charitably and give the best version of the story, the autocephaly granted to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was a recognition of the fact that they had some unique qualities that they should be given the ability to steward for themselves. That would be my charitable understanding of the issue.
So it's not a separation, yeah?
No.
It's not a schism, not at all.
Not a schism.
Oh,
yeah, not at all.
Oh, the same Christology. Okay, it's not a schism. Okay,
That's right.
that's fine.
No.
Yeah.
Sorry, I could have just given a simpler answer there.
Oh, it's not a schism. Okay, good.
Great. We probably should finish now. We've got to 3:30. All the questions finished. Just expressing my appreciation really for your talk, Calum, and the stimulating conversation that it's produced. It's always good to,
Thank you.
as I am actually Calum's doctoral supervisor, so I see the work develop, and it's always significantly moved on each time we revisit it. So I'm really delighted to see that, and it's a real privilege to have you here with us. So can we a usual.
Thank you so much.
And next week's talk, you'll just have me because Calum is in an aeroplane. So next week we'll talk about Enoch as a Christian text. Thank you, Calum.
Thank you, Calum.
Thank you. Bye-bye to everyone. Have a good day. Thank you again.
So the Christology is quite similar.
Yes. Yeah, somewhere.
It's not.
One sentence was prophet.
Yes, it's not Chalcedonian, but there's Egypt, Syria, Ethiopia, Armenia.
Yeah, instead, because usually it was always the Pope of Alexandria who would ordain the bishop for them.
Yes.
They were first pleased to ordain the one.
Yeah. Well, the key in Ethiopia lies with a philosophical inability to abstract the nature from a body.
It's not a schism.
It's completely non-dualistic thinking. So two natures is Nestorianism. It's two bodies that are not
It's
unified.
very political.
They can't accommodate a Chalcedonian, which is primarily a Greek Latin way of thinking about Christ. That's the root of it. But their formula, it's interesting in Ethiopia, the formula that they would recite in church is identical to the Chalcedonian Creed, except for
Actually, it
you know,
was like
one nature, fully divine, fully human, without confusion, never to be separated. All those words are there. It's just one nature.
we had a Pope who came in.
But it's not the same. One of the problems with Chalcedon
And he
was
did-
that
he didn't want
the
them to-
Egyptians and the
to
Ethiopians were
believe
tarred with the same brush as
He said,
Eutyches.
We will make
Now,
you
Eutyches
a
thought that
separate church.
Christ's humanity was
We
basically
want to
subdued
remain
into
separate.
divinity at the
So we will
ascension.
make it.
and
So
ceased to
they
exist. It
prayed,
had no
they prayed, and
function.
they did distribute it.
The
Yeah.
Egyptians and the
Because they didn't know
Syrians,
before this.
who were the main protagonists of Chalcedon, never believed that. Eutyches is anathematized in Egypt and in Ethiopia, as well as in Rome.
I know.
So do they
when
do that
an
not
army
hold to the
something back when you
hypostasis?
study different things.
Well, they have their own word for that.
All right,
They
because
use
in
the concept
the
of
Chalcedonian Creed, you have
reduction
a
is the
single,
approach.
Yeah,
And that is-
the nature. So,
and
Yeah.
two,
God's
two
missing.
ideas, so you have to get to the Greek to be
Yeah.
able
No,
to.
so this, I think,
There's some-
difficult to-
Held under the person as one
To
person.
make
Yeah.
things, I mean, not
Yeah.
only those
All
who
right.
study.
But-
They would say in Ethiopia, they would, like Cyril,
And they use this.
they would say
reductionism.
out of two natures.
Possible.
That is
Yes.
exactly.
So the one nature comes from the two.
It's
But
it's
yeah,
not so fluid, so fluid.
So
Yeah.
That's the
I hope
Greek
and I wish they would
word.
at the
And
beginning
also,
they would say
I'm
that is
not
reductionism.
vaccination.
Rather than that is the
Because
human
although it's a
church.
mystery, we know
Because
that
when
a
they
person.
put
people
the positive book, it says the spin, that is the Syrian church.
And so we get.
That when this is now it's kind of reduction, reduction of something.
What the true nature of the.
Yeah.
And we understand the true nature of divinity as far as we can know. I mean, there's stuff that we.
Yeah.
Know in that. But for me, that holds the two in tension. The others seem to me somewhat confused and always have been. As to go, well, we need to hold these are mixed, but the problem is at what point is Christ really like us? If he's if
Yeah.
he's Superman. And can leap over tall buildings in a single bound,
How is this?
he's not human.
Or
And
if he
so-
doesn't
so-
get hungry.
Yeah, right,
Is
right,
it-
yeah.
I mean, and what if
Which he
never
does.
gets sick and
Exactly, and so that's the problem that Athanasius saw, Athanasius saw that if he's not really human.
Yeah.
If he's just in some way, you've fallen back into the Docetist fray.
Was it,
And holding those in tension is what's been the,
you said you'd read something about it,
Strauss.
Steve Strauss, yes. I know Steve, well, I knew Steve. His was quite an interesting thing. It was the first serious Western study done of Ethiopian
Yeah,
Christology.
so I was reading globalizing theology and his thing, and I was like, oh, I need to look. I'm gonna read that.
But
So
Yeah.
I read it like 10
And
years
it was
ago.
See the date of the encyclopedia?
Yeah.
I updated one in May,
yes,
so it's a better version than before. It's not monophysite.
yeah, they've got the Miat side.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
pro-